Known as the largest naval battle in modern history, it was a decisive victory for the Allied forces and marked the beginning of Japan's naval decline in World War II. This battle was crucial in the liberation of the Philippines, showcasing the importance of air and sea power, coordination, and strategic deception. In this analysis, we'll break down the key events, commanders, and outcomes that shaped the course of the Pacific War. This is the review of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This analysis is divided into subparts: the definition of the subject, setting the stage, describing the action, assessing the significance. The definition of the subject includes the determination and evaluation of the research materials, followed by the definition of the subject through a brief introduction of selected battle. The research materials include ebooks which contain detailed operational, strategic, and tactical analysis of both Imperial Japanese forces and Allied forces during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The web articles contain a collection of summarized battle information of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, while the documentaries contain information from military historians, military tacticians, and veterans from the said battle. As a caveat, the bias in these contents is that most of the information in the books, documentaries, and even web articles came from US and Australian sources. Most of it was made by the Americans, while some of the information was shaped in favor of a one sided story. This battle review analysis is about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is considered as one of the greatest and most significant naval battles in history, fought between the Allied forces and the Imperial Japanese forces. It is primarily composed of four interrelated battles: the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle of Cape Inganyo, and the Battle of Samar. This took place in the Philippine Sea off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines from October 23 to 26, 1944. The decisive air and sea battle of World War II in the Pacific Theater of War crippled the Japanese combined fleet, permitted US invasion of the Philippines, and reinforced the Allies' control of the Pacific. This was considered as a defining moment for the Imperial Japanese forces, as it would also set the tone for them on whether they would continue or sustain their invasion in Asia, as well as a focal point where the Allied Southwest Pacific forces were to converge. The Central Pacific forces' mighty assault to wrest the Philippines from the hands of the Japanese. Now, let's talk about the setting stage. Setting the stage is subdivided into parts, which include strategic and operational overview of the Battle of Leyte and how it came about. The battle to be analyzed happened during the World War II in the Pacific Ocean theater, specifically in the Leyte Gulf. The Gulf is bounded in the north by Samar, in the west by Leyte, south by Mindanao Islands, separated from Leyte by the Surigao Strait. The Nagat Islands party encloses the Gulf in the southeast. The small Homonhon Island in Suluan Island set stride the eastern entrance to the Gulf. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese did a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and inflicted heavy damage on the US military. Subsequently, on the winter and spring of 1942, the Japanese amassed a vast new empire in the Pacific with a defensive perimeter that ranged from western Alaska to the Solomon Islands, while the Southwest Pacific area, Japan threatened the American supply lines to Australia, thus complicating US plans to use Australia as a staging ground for offensive action against the offending country. Because of this newly established Japanese empire, an alliance was formed to mount a counterattack. The New Zealand, Australia, and the States crafted the Pacific Strategy. That is a long counterattack across the Pacific and advancing towards Japan. The United States mounted its first major amphibious landing in World War II at Guadalcanal in August 1942 and seized a strategic airfield site. This is in Henderson Field on the island and resulted in halting the Japanese efforts to disrupt supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. This marked the start of the Japanese being driven back into the Pacific theater. Furthermore, the Allied forces implemented a practice of skipping over heavily fortified islands in order to seize lightly defended locations that could support the next advance. In addition to the island hopping, the US pursued a two-pronged offensive against the Japanese across the central and southwest Pacific, advancing towards Japan. Shown on your left screen or right screen are the four main actions in the Battle of Leyte. At the dawn of October 23, 1944, the initial phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf happened when Admiral Takeo's fleet passed the Palawan's island. Subsequently, the USS Days and Darter torpedoed and sunk two Japanese heavy cruisers. On the following day, the primary engagement was at the Sibuyan Sea, where the relentless surface and airstrikes occurred, damaging major vessels, supporting vessels, and air assets. The Battle of Surigao Strait is one of the four separate actions known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Japanese attempt to destroy the vast American fleet, supporting the amphibious landings in Leyte. Surigao Strait consisted of two battle engagements between one US force and two uncoordinated Japanese forces due to radio silence under Vice Admirals Nishimura and Shima. Both were decisive Japanese defeats, while US forces under Rear Admiral Jess Oldendorf suffered only slight damage and no losses. Simultaneously with the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle of Samar likewise resulted in the massive defeat of the Japanese forces and making the battleship Yamato retreat. In Cape Inganyo, the battle between the Japanese Imperial Navy Third Fleet of the Northern Force and the American Third Fleet was all but fate. The Japanese Imperial Navy planned it under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to draw the American Third Fleet away from the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, leaving the Americans vulnerable to an attack from Japanese forces coming from the west headed by Admiral Kurita's Central Force. Uzawa was ordered to deliberately allow his force to be spotted and pursued by the American Third Fleet commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey. Admiral Ozawa had been successful in his mission to draw Halsey's fleet away from Leyte Gulf, but his fleet was eventually destroyed by the latter during the subsequent ship chase. This shows the all battles that happened in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. The next slide will be about the overview of the environmental elements that influence the fate of the Leyte Gulf War. The weather greatly affected the battle between the Allied forces and the Imperial Japanese. The weather during operation was covered with heavy fog that gave way to high winds with rain and thunder, reducing visibility. Weather at the entrance to Leyte Gulf at daybreak of October 20, 1944 was cloudy with alto astratus clouds and 5/10 swelling cumulus bases at 2,500 feet. Visibly to seaward 12 miles, a barometer reading of 1009.9 millibars, and the wind force 2 from the southeast. For the observation and fields of fire, the Leyte operation was to be the pivotal fight of the Pacific War. All the battles that happened in the Battle of Leyte Gulf are in open seas. There was no prominent terrain during the series of battles, and both forces were on the sea. For the opticals, some of the opticals for both forces are the gushing of waves, the thick smoke and fogs, and the remains of the wrecked ship or wrecked ship, which hindered the momentum of movement for Imperial Japanese forces and Allied forces. The key terrain of both forces lies in who has the better control over the sea. The advantage of Allied forces was they are gaining an advantage when their warships and destroyers were able to position their weapons against the Imperial Japanese forces while the Imperial Japanese are still maneuvering toward the Allied forces when they clash with each other. For cover and concealment, the fogs from rain and the smoke from wrecked ship became concealment for both forces. There are times that they move closer to the enemy line without being detected from sight, but because of miscommunication. Both forces often got mistaken from identifying other vessels as their ally or enemy. Hmm. And lastly, for the avenue of approach, The plan of the US is to use the Pacific side to gain access to Asia by invading the Philippines. From Australia, they took the course of going from the south part of the Philippines to the north before going to Formosa, now we call Taiwan, while the Imperial Japanese took the course from Singapore going to Palawan and then eventually to the islands of the Visayas to engage the Allied force. Let's discuss further in the next slides the size and composition. Shown are the size and composition of both forces. It is evidently that the Allied forces has the supremacy compared to the Imperial Japanese fleet. Allied forces has 200,000 troops, 120,000 air and naval forces, and 3,000 guerrillas. And for the Imperial Japanese fleet has 85,000 troops, 41 tanks, and the number of air and naval forces. Now here are the organization of Allied forces. The Pacific Theater are divided into command areas. Southwest Pacific areas with General Douglas MacArthur as the commander-in-chief, and the Pacific Ocean area to include Central Pacific with Admiral Chester Nimitz as commander-in-chief. This is one of the Central Philippine Attack Force, or the TF-77 under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid. His first fleet are divided into two task forces. The first task force is the Task Force 78, Northern Attack Force, under Rear Admiral Daniel Barbie. And the second is Task Force 79, the Southern Attack Force under Vice Admiral Theodore Wilkinson. Shown is the Southern Army under Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi of Imperial Japanese from direct supervision of Imperial General Headquarters. The Southern Army composed of 3rd Marine Transport Command under Major General Masasumi Inada, 4th Air Army headed by Lieutenant General Kyoji Tominaga, and the 14th Area Army led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Under the different divisions and mixed brigades. For the technology, both has aircraft carriers serve as seagoing air bases equipped with a flight deck and facilities for carrying, arming, deploying, and recovering aircraft. Only the difference are the numbers of carrier in both forces. Shown are the battleship of two forces. For the Allied forces is the South Dakota class battleship, and for Imperial Japanese fleet is the Musashi battleship. Battleships are used to control sea lines and ensure bombardments. They serve as protective screen against surface and air attacks, also provide gunfire support for land operations. Cruisers were lightly armored, heavily armed, fast ship designed to screen formations and to scout out enemy fleets. Their survivability depends on speed. Destroyers were designed to operate with battle fleet with significant firepower, guns, and torpedoes. That was for the sole purpose of defeating, right? Defeating enemy destroyers and sinking larger ships. Specifications are dependent on what type of carrier. For the escort destroyer, a warship of medium or light displacement whose mission was to protect ocean convoys and naval squadrons from attacks by submarines. Patrol torpedo boats were small, fast, and expendable for short range and oceanic scouting, armed with torpedoes and machine guns for cutting enemy supply lines and harassing enemy forces. Submarines play an important role in time of war, including anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare, intelligence gathering, mine reconnaissance, land attacks, defend gathering, fleet ships, and rescue downed pilots. And for fleet auxiliaries is a naval ship designed to support combatant ships and other naval operations. Auxiliary ships are not primary combatant vessels, though they may have some limited combat capacity, though usually for purpose of self-defense. Support the fleet by providing underway, replenishment to major fleet units. This allow the fleet to remain in same location. Shown are the planes used during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They had their own specifications and capability. The planes of both forces has primary mission: air-to-air combat, bombing, aerial reconnaissance, and troop and supply transportation. Shown are the escort carrier from Allied and Japanese forces, usually defend the the convoys and provide air support during amphibious operation. Much smaller than a fleet carrier and had fewer planes. The Allied forces' existing tactical doctrine provided by a backdrop for offensive preparations. Sophisticated and subtle after refinement in the interwar period. The doctrine set of major tactics, those for a large fleet in battle, were thorough and flexible. They covered a variety of contingencies apart from the main fleet action. Cruisers and destroyers were drilled in night search and attack. Procedures designed to locate and manage an enemy battle fleet. A combination of approaches was used to satisfy the operational goals of the Central Pacific Offensive. The Imperial Japanese Fleet. It is decisive. They used a decisive battle doctrine. The Japanese Navy would win a war by fighting and winning a single decisive naval action. The idea gained broad acceptance following the Russo-Japanese War, where a well-trained, smaller Japanese naval force gained a decisive victory against the Imperial Russian Navy. General MacArthur recognized the need for making use of Leyte as logistical base by creating for the first time in the Southwest Pacific an Army Service Command and by detailing his chief engineer, Major U.J. Cassett, to be its commander. General MacArthur directed the 6th Army to establish aircraft facilities or air facilities in the Leyte area. The final 6th Army plan for the Leyte operation directed ASCOM to establish naval facilities in the Leyte area as well as the aforementioned air facilities to make topographic and hydrographic surveys, followed by suitable changes in plans for the construction of bases, docks, roads, and aerodromes. For an invasion force of 150,000 men, the War Department figures showed that for the landing period alone, 1,500,000 tons of general equipment, 235,000 tons of combat vehicles, 200,000 tons of ammunition, and 1,000 tons of medical supplies were required. In terms of the Imperial Japanese fleet, use of air carrier to soften the US protection of the landing force and to permit fleet action to prevent landing force. The result, questionable due to devastation of Japanese carrier air capability at the Battle of Philippine Sea. The necessity of sending reinforcement to Formosa also weakened considerably the Japanese aerial defense of the Philippines, completely dependent on the remaining land-based planes. The Japanese were preparing to stake their whole remaining striking power on a gigantic gamble to maintain their position in the Philippines. The Japanese are willing to risk the loss of their entire mobile fleet for the opportunity of maneuvering their cruisers and battleship to within the target range of the troop and supply transport in Leyte Gulf. The C3 system of Allied forces involved marshalling of forces from two Pacific theaters. The overall command fell under General MacArthur. BC Leyte is located within the SWIFT. However, the U.S. command structure did not provide unity of operational command, and there was no appointment of the Joint Task Force Command as prescribed procedure for joint Army and Navy operations. As a result, the command or commander of the 6th Army commands the land component, and the naval and air component retains as direct oversight for the operations. For the Imperial Japanese fleet, their command organization or their organizational headquarters remains in Tokyo. Same situation with the Allied forces. They also do not have unity of command for the operations. This resulted to Japanese staff operating independently. Further, they have no unified command, so coordination between land and naval forces were difficult. Hmm. They also desired decentralized execution. Hmm. However, unreliability and difficulty of long-range communication did not permit coordination between the operational command and other commanders. And so, for C3, Allied forces has more effective system than the Japanese fleet. The purposes of the operation of the Allied forces in the Pacific, particularly in the Philippines, are for the following reasons. First, to cut the supply lines such as the sources of rubber, oil, and other raw materials used for military purposes of Imperial Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. Second, to retake the Philippines, at the same time establish a base before proceeding to an invasion of Formosa and mainland China. And finally, to invade the mainland Japan. But in order to fulfill this plan, only one course of action must be made, and multiple plans and suggestions were raised during the planning phase. But in the end, it was the plan of General Douglas MacArthur that is the invasion of the Philippines and securing the country before invading Formosa and the rest of the countries being occupied by Imperial Japanese forces. Meanwhile, the island of the Philippines play an important role in Southeast Asia as the Philippines is the gateway to Southeast Asia from the Pacific. If the Philippines will be controlled again by the Allied forces, the lifeblood of their operation will be cut off. The Imperial Japanese forces knew about this and is one of the reasons why they cannot just hand over the island to the Allied forces. They need the Philippines. They left with no choice but to employ a decoy from the northern force to lure most of the Allied fleet away from the ground forces and use the central force to engage head on with the main fleet of invading forces in Leyte. This may not assure their victory in the battle, but it will inflict great damage against Allied forces if conducted successfully. The Imperial Japanese Navy was positioned in the different parts of the Philippine island. Their central force or forces were positioned on the western side while the decoys were positioned in the northeast side of the country. And some of their forces are positioned in the islands of southern Luzon and at the Sulu Sea. Four Japanese surface forces participated in the Shogo, including every type of ship in their inventory. Three surface battleship, would drive the Americans from the Leyte beachhead. The fourth force, consisting the aircraft carriers and two old hybrid carriers battleship, would be used as a decoy to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet northward away from Leyte during this stage of the war. Due to fuel shortages, the majority of these warships were stationed at two widely dispersed locations. So, located in the Japanese homeland at Kure Naval Base in the inland sea, where the mobile fleet's remaining aircraft carriers. The Allied forces came from southern side of the Pacific. Australia, the southern side of the Pacific, the Australia. So they were divided into two fleets. The fleet led by Admiral Chester Nimitz. So once again, the Allied forces came from the southern side of the Pacific, Australia. They were divided into two fleets. The fleet led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, which was positioned on the western side of the Pacific, and the fleet led by General Douglas MacArthur, which was positioned in the southern part of the Philippines, which conducted the amphibious operation in the island of Leyte, while Admiral Halsey, positioned also in the western side of the Pacific, was tasked of securing the ground force from naval attacks. Guiding the Leyte beachhead were the northern and southern fire support units commanded by Rear Admiral Oldendroft and Rear Admiral Whaler. So the greatest naval warfare in history happened in the Leyte Gulf. So this occurred when the Allied forces came from southern side of the Pacific, Australia. They were divided into two fleets. The fleet led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, which was positioned on the western side of the Pacific, and the fleet led by General Douglas MacArthur, which was positioned in the southern part of the Philippines, which conducted the amphibious operation in the island of Leyte, while Admiral Halsey, positioned also in the western side of the Pacific, was tasked of securing the ground force from naval attacks. The Imperial Japanese Navy was positioned in the different parts of the Philippine Islands. Their central forces were positioned on western side, while their decoys were positioned on the northeast side of the Philippine Islands, and some of their forces are positioned in the islands of southern Luzon and at the Sulu Sea. Carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's ship conducted a series of strikes to obtain information of enemy installations and to destroy air and surface strength, which might interfere with landing on Leyte. U.S. submarines Darter and Days discovered and attacked the number one diversion attack force of Admiral Kurita while entering the Palawan Passage. The next day, the next day, 24 October 1944, Third Fleet aircraft located the center force of Admiral Kurita's fleet in Sibuyan Sea and the southern force in the Sulu Sea. In this battle, the battleship the battleship of the Imperial Japanese Naval Forces, the battleship Musashi, sank after various attacks from Allied airstrikes. Although some of the Allied fleets were also severely damaged until they become devastated. In the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, as shown on the slide, the Musashi of Admiral Kurita's fleet sank. When Kurita turned around, the American pilots thought he was retreating. But he turned again and made his way through San Bernardo Strait in the night to appear off Samar in the morning. How deceiving is that? On October 24, 1944, the Battle of Surigao Strait occurred. It happened during nighttime. In this battle, another battleship from the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Fuso, sank along with three destroyers, Asagumo, Mechisyo, and Yamaguno. Later on in this battle, Nishimura was killed, while the battleships Samashiro and the cruiser Mogami were severely damaged but were able to miraculously escape the wreckage, and the surviving ships retreated west. During the Battle of Samar, just after Vice Admiral Halsey took the bait of Imperial Japanese forces in the north and left amphibious forces on Leyte unprotected, Admiral Kurita's attack moved south along the coast of Samar. Admiral Kurita engaged only the ships consisting only of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. In this battle, the biggest ever battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Yamato, was introduced along with 8 cruisers and a dozen of destroyers. The battle lasted for around 2 hours, with some losses from both forces. Allied forces suffered great losses in this battle. Around October 24 to 25, the Battle of Cape Engano, the last phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, occurred where Vice Admiral Halsey fleet moved to the north and took the bait of the Imperial Japanese forces. This battle occurred at the same time as the Battle of Samar. The result of this battle was very obvious, as its main objective was to lure the majority of the Allied fleet away from the island of Samar so that the fleet of Admiral Kurita would eventually attack the forces left at Samar. During this battle, Vice Admiral Halsey was unaware of what happened during near the coast of Samar. Upon knowing the drama occurring the coast of Samar, Vice Admiral Halsey immediately dispatched airstrikes to harass the escaping fleet of Admiral Kurita, the Central Force, and took his fastest battleships, the USS New Jersey and USS Iowa, on the pursuit of Kurita's escaping fleet. So the next would be the outcome, the mission accomplishment. Under the mission accomplishment, the Allied forces destroyed Japanese naval power. U.S. Allied forces revived its control in the Pacific and seas in Asia. And U.S. Allied forces to lead advancement to Ryukyu Island in 1945. For the effects on sources, due to the extended duration and breadth of the engagement, stories differ regarding casualties that occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and those that occurred shortly before. Shortly after, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered its worst loss of ships and sailors. The inevitable loss of the Philippines meant to cut off from Japan occupied territories in Southeast Asia, and the downfall of its supply line from regions revived its control in the Pacific and seas in Asia. More than 1,600 sailors and air crewmen of the Allied escort carrier were killed. The losses of the Battle of Leyte Gulf were not evenly distributed throughout the forces or all forces. The comparison of losses from the battlefield. The U.S. Allied forces, they lost three significant air carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, soldiers, while Imperial Japanese forces lost four aircrafts, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, plus aircraft, then soldiers. Moreover, according to Fuller, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered its worst loss of ships and sailors in history. Failure to drive the Allied invaders out of Leyte meant the inevitable loss of the Philippines, which meant Japan would be cut off from its occupied territories in Southeast Asia, and the downfall of its supply line from regions that provided crucial resources to Japan, particularly the oil and the rubber for the ships and aviation. Studying history helps us understand how events in the past made things the way they are today. Specifically, history of wars and all the lessons from the past have opened our understanding not only about ourselves and how we came to be, but also it develops in us the ability to avoid mistakes and create better methods in our mission to protect the country. Based on the facts presented, it is clear that the Allied forces won this great naval battle. The decisive was the destruction of Admiral Kurita's central force is the last encounter in Samar. Upon knowing that Kurita's force was severely damaged and retreated, Vice Admiral Ozawa withdrew northward, going back to Japan, which ended their plan on defeating the invasion of Allied forces in Leyte. The series of battles in Leyte Gulf forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to withdraw to their main force in Formosa, leaving their ground forces in some parts of the Philippines and cutting their control over Southeast Asia. The errors made during the war were not due to lack of preparation. Any mistakes were errors of judgment rather than errors of organization. Judgments in leadership was the basis of on the outcome of the battle. No matter who analyzed the battle both in the past and in the present, the blame for the possible victory of the Japanese forces in Leyte has been charged to Admiral Halsey for failing to make the right decision during the critical time by pursuing the Japanese forces in the north instead of defending forces in Samar. Same with Admiral or Vice Admiral Kurita, who does not take advantage of the opportunity to attack its smaller enemy with that single chance. So leaders should make sure to study all options before making decisions, especially during critical times. Stronger and reliable intelligence system is a big factor in the formulation and execution of overall strategy. Of course, success of military operations is heavily dependent on the complete information from its intelligence. In this case, the Allied forces failed to notify Admiral Halsey of the vulnerability of the northern forces of Vice Admiral Osawa, thus leading his entire fleet going north. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Kurita failed to take advantage of the opportunity due to the lack of knowledge regarding the strength of its enemy. And also, the absence of unity of command would mean disaster. There should be a single commander in all operations in order to ensure the perfect implementation of plans and strategies. The facts showed us that the chain of command was, on the whole, very effective for the Allied forces. However, one exemption almost ended in catastrophe since Third Fleet was under separate control than invading force. The split in command between two fleets converging on the same location, not communicating or coordinating, mess with each other became obvious when Halsey ordered all his ships in the Third Fleet to stem north in pursuit of what turned out to be a decoy force. On the other hand, the Japanese military faced several organizational challenges that threatened the undermined ability to implement the Shogo plan effectively. One of the essential elements in this battle is the unity of command. Another is the deplete resource of the enemy in order to weaken their will to fight. One of the main objectives of the Allied forces was to win positions that would allow them to sever Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia and to make possible an invasion or neutralization of Formosa, now Taiwan, and the East China coast before moving to the Japanese home island. In effect, once the decisive Battle of Leyte was lost, the Japanese gave up hope of retaining the Philippines, conceding the Allies a strategic country from which they are aiming to get resources. In fact, after World War II, Japan still had the capability to build ships and airplanes, but they didn't have the supply of oil and other resources to make it work. The Allied forces concentrated their maximum firepower on the approaching enemy. Japanese forces divided their forces into three, thus reducing their chances of winning. As to the tempo, the Allied forces have operated according to its timeline. In terms of audacity, both forces showed courage in difficult situations, even if it meant death, just to achieve their mission. As to the unity of command, both forces had leadership issues in terms of a unified decision and close coordination. The Allied forces made use of their forces in a strategic manner in terms of economy of force. As to the mission command, there was a lack of coordination and proper communication. The Allied forces utilize powerful air and naval assaults had weakened the Japanese forces. And as to protection, both forces had been vulnerable to attack, although the Allied forces had an almost perfect plan in execution. They became vulnerable on the later part. As a summary, the objective was crucial aspect of the conflict. Overall, the American aims were clearly stated, resulting in a successful invasion. Japan's indecision on its ground and naval goals resulted in uncertainty. It made the Americans' landing attempt easier, and the Japanese lost as a catastrophic naval battle that put their operations in the Philippines in peril. As to the offensive, the invasion of Leyte was a pivotal point in the war in the Pacific, and with it, the attack became more significant. While the Battle of Leyte was crucial or mainly a defensive struggle, the use of offensive tactics by the Allies was crucial. The Americans seized the chance to advance and hit their preferred target at a distance. The Japanese were put in a position where they had to respond to an American invasion that happened at a place and time that was unexpected. Despite using a stunning naval assault to resist the attack, they were unsuccessful and ultimately lost. The importance of security at the Battle of Leyte cannot be underestimated. What is more relevant is that the Japanese did not have any security procedures. They made the grave error of not investigating the US fleet's position and strength, allowing them to be entirely unprepared for the attack on Leyte. It shocked them greatly because they failed to supply commanders with crucial information and inadequate communications equipment. The Japanese naval officers were ill equipped to lead their forces throughout the battle. As a result, the admirals had a poor understanding of the US fleet's position and their knowledge of Japanese fleet's condition. The maneuver of or movement of the ships was a critical aspect of the naval battles. Despite this, the Japanese admirals, particularly Nishimura and Kurita, refused to maneuver when it was most important. It led to Nishimura's downfall, and it may help push Kurita to split off an action that he might have won in the first place. As to the unity of command, one of the essential elements in this battle is the unity of command. The American chain of command was, on the whole, very effective. However, one exemption almost ended in catastrophe since Third Fleet was under separate control than invading force. As to the simplicity, because the Japanese shogo or the shogo plan was overly complicated, it did not work because simplicity is vital in this battle. So that will be the end of this analysis. Thank you.